When we picture the ancient Mediterranean world, we're usually shown a familiar map. Greece to the north. Rome at the center. Egypt, often treated as a distant exception. But this picture hides a deeper truth. For centuries, African dynasties were not peripheral to the Mediterranean world. They were foundational to it. They governed trade routes. They stabilized empires. They shaped religion, culture, diplomacy, and power, often at the very moment Mediterranean civilization was taking form. Today, we're not revisiting myths or legends. We're examining documented dynasties, recognized by archaeology, inscriptions, and classical historians. From the Nile Valley to the Red Sea. From North Africa to the Near East. These African powers didn't just interact with the Mediterranean. They helped define it. Long before Rome rose, long before Athens reached its golden age, Egypt was already ancient. By the time Greek city-states were forming, Egyptian dynasties had already ruled continuously for over 2,000 years. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and later, the New Kingdom, each represented centralized African rule with Mediterranean reach. Egypt's position was strategic. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea. To the east, the Levant and Mesopotamia. To the south, Nubia and Inner Africa. This wasn't isolation. It was connection. Egyptian grain fed Mediterranean populations. Egyptian gold stabilized ancient economies. Egyptian scribes influenced record-keeping across the region. Greek historians noticed this. Herodotus openly acknowledged Egypt as a source of learning. From geometry, to philosophy, to religious concepts that later echoed across the Mediterranean. And when foreign powers arrived, they didn't erase Egyptian authority. They adapted to it. Persians ruled Egypt through Egyptian systems. Greeks adopted Egyptian religious titles. Romans maintained Egyptian administrative structures. That's not marginal influence. That's civilizational gravity. South of Egypt, another African power was rising. The kingdom of Kush, centered in Nubia, was not merely a neighbor. It became a ruling dynasty of Egypt itself. In the 8th century BCE, Kushite kings established Egypt's 25th dynasty. African rulers governing both Upper Egypt and Nubia, uniting regions that stretched deep into the African continent. These kings weren't outsiders. They restored Egyptian temples. They revived traditional religious practices. They ruled as legitimate pharaohs. Mediterranean powers noticed. Assyrian records describe Kushite Egypt as a major geopolitical force. Levantine city-states adjusted alliances accordingly. This dynasty controlled trade routes linking Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean. Routes that moved gold, ivory, incense, and grain. When later histories compressed timelines, this African-led chapter was often shortened. But it was real. It was stable. And it shaped Mediterranean power balances for generations. If Egypt dominated the eastern Mediterranean, Carthage ruled the western seas. Founded in North Africa, Carthage grew into a naval empire controlling Sicily, southern Iberia, key Mediterranean trade corridors. Carthage was African by geography and governance, even as it inherited Phoenician maritime knowledge. Its ruling dynasties governed from African soil, using African resources, with African strategic priorities. Carthaginian fleets weren't defensive. They projected power. Their trade networks moved metals, textiles, food, and ideas across the sea. Rome understood this. The Punic Wars weren't cultural misunderstandings. They were clashes between two competing Mediterranean systems. For over a century, Carthage and Rome existed as equals. That alone tells us something important. When Carthage fell, Rome inherited African infrastructure, ports, routes, and administrative experience. The Mediterranean Rome dominated had already been shaped by African governance. When Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt, he didn't conquer a vacuum. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled from Alexandria, but they governed as Egyptian pharaohs. They maintained African agricultural systems. They preserved temple economies. They relied on Nile-based stability. This dynasty connected Africa to the Hellenistic world, not by erasing African systems, but by integrating them. Alexandria became a Mediterranean intellectual center, because it sat atop African foundations. Even Rome treated Egypt differently. It was governed directly by the emperor, recognized as a pillar of Mediterranean survival. So why does this history feel unfamiliar? Part of the answer lies in how later histories were written. Roman chroniclers emphasized Rome. Medieval scholars prioritized Europe. Modern narrative simplified complexity. African dynasties didn't disappear. They were condensed. Sometimes footnoted. Sometimes detached from their geography. Coins. Inscriptions. Trade goods found across the Mediterranean basin. They all point to the same conclusion. Africa wasn't a recipient of Mediterranean history. It was one of its architects. When we redraw the ancient Mediterranean map, Africa doesn't sit at the edge. It stands at the center. From dynasties along the Nile, to Kushite rulers bridging continents, to Carthaginian fleets shaping sea power, African governance helped define the ancient world that later civilizations inherited. Understanding this doesn't replace history. It completes it. And once you see it, the Mediterranean world never looks the same again.